I'm well respected as a lord of the blade. Got a dozen guildmates, always up.
Greetings, welcome, and I am so glad to have you with us here at Nycos. I'm Jonathan Albin, and the creator of the Nycos RPG. And while this channel will occasionally focus on the role-playing game itself, I want today's episode to be more particularly focused on games in general and the way we have gotten to where we've gotten, so to speak. But before that, I would like to introduce you introduce myself to you a little bit better. All right. So, if you haven't played role-play games, this would be a great way for you to learn about them. If you are a role player with any amount of experience, welcome from a slightly different perspective, because this is going to be a kind of a different ride. All right, so I'm obviously crappy at the introductions, and this is my second video back since my hiatus. So thank you for coming back. If you're coming back to the show and remember what we were talking about before, what the world is like and all that. And if not, let me first start by introducing myself. I'm Jonathan Albin, and I've been a game master for a solid 50 years. I learned to play the game Dungeons & Dragons from one of the designers. My buddy's grandpa Dave was Dave Arneson, and though I only played for a couple of sessions with him, it changed my life in that for 50 years nonstop, I have run at least one game session per week as an average. And during the COVID period, I was running 9 sessions a week, all of them interacting with each other in the same worldview, or same world, same time frame. And we even had crossover episodes where Group A would actually physically join Group B on air because they were in the same area and therefore had an opportunity to interact. I've also had a very colorful career. I've been an avionics technician on the SR-71 Blackbird, an air traffic controller, microwave antenna installer, cellular technician. I owned a trucking company and a lawn care company, and worked as a warehouse forklift operator. Just all tons of things. But I say all of that to say this: the realm of Nycos throughout the entire period, it has been a developing story that is absolutely stuffed with Easter eggs from all the different games groups that I've participated with. What you need to know about me is that as a game master, I have been instrumental in teaching more than 12,000 people to play role-playing games, and that's me sitting across the table from people. I have also been a professional speaker and a representative for Konami Digital Entertainment, in particular reaching the retailer organizations through organized play. And I was also the marketing director for Gamma for a time, dealing with the manufacturers of all games products in the US and Canada and beyond. But I've also been a writer. I've got several books that are available on Amazon, and if you have an opportunity to take a look at those, I greatly appreciate any reviews you might provide for me. But that's all about what I want, and let's talk instead about what this subject is, which is an introduction. But I want to talk in particular about well, as a storyteller and game master, I have been able to observe from my perch, if you will, as a advocate for role playing and for the most part for the Dungeons and Dragons brand for a really long time, regardless of which manufacturer held the control of it. I've been playing since the very beginning, and as a storyteller, I look at things perhaps different now. I want to make sure this is clear. The reason why I seem a little bit halting in my presentation today is that I'm struggling a little bit. I realize that from the standpoint of being a storyteller, that puts me in a position of being a fiction creator, in essence. And what I want to talk about now is actually the factual stuff. And not least among those things I want to talk about is the dynamics of play. I want you to look back for a second to your childhood, and if you're like me, you're a human being. Yeah, I know, this seems crazy, but as a human being, we have, as our elements of education as children, we have our periods of work, if you will, where we're actually striving to learn through school and our parental guidance over us, and even social interaction for learning social cues and such. But that work of learning is only part of the process. The other part of it is the play portion. And we're going to be talking about play in general because I think that it's an underrelated issue. There's a phrase that I use, and that is that games are a big idea whose time has come. And today I want to talk about that in particular and what the dynamics of play really represent. For my part, I identify several different categories of play, the first of which is imitative play. And that's where, for example, in a small child, you'll see times when they want to dress just like mom or just like dad. They want to dive into the imagination by trying to consider what it would be like to have the job of mom, the job of dad. And so they'll, little boys will put on their work clothes and get their little toolbox and go out the door like their dads do to go to work every day, and they'll go out to their playground or whatever and pull out their tools, and in their minds they are repairing or fixing or building or whatever their parents do. They're trying to imitate it. They have seen certain things, and so therefore they're trying to imagine how that works and how that interacts. And they know that I keep saying that dad bangs on with a hammer on something and says, okay, it's fixed, and that's in their imagination. They're doing exactly what they've seen. And that imaginative play is instrumental in developing as a human being. One of the challenges of parenting in a generation where both parents work all the time is it's really difficult for the kids to pick up on those things to replicate. And so often they will imitate things that they see on a television program or what they've observed in their own lives in whatever fashion that they can. And imitation play does help with social cues. It helps with defining our understanding of our place in the world. But there's another side of play that we often overlook, and that's the truly imaginative play. That's where the child or the person, in our own cases, tries to interact with the world within what they perceive of it, and then embark on pathways that perhaps they haven't any information. For example, they've watched programs about space travel, or they've seen some science fiction shows, and they imagine what it would be like to land on a distant planet, or to perceive the one we live in as actually the alien world and try to explore it. And when we utilize imagination in this fashion, the playfulness of it is certainly there, because we're still not, it's not serious. It's not going to, impact physically the world, but what it does do is it physically, it does, and it changes the way we think. And the more wide-ranging our imaginative play field is, the more opportunities we provide ourselves for interaction with change and possibilities in our own world. There is, however, I believe, a difference between the way people interact through toys and those that interact through games. And I'll go a little bit into that in a moment. But first I want to talk about is when we are talking about play and imitative play, it's really easy to find toys, facsimiles, alternates that we can provide for imitation. They're easy to find. We can, you can go to any department store, and they don't even call them department stores anymore, but the concept of the Target or the Walmart, and go to the toy section and find play tools and play articles for replicating life and allowing the kids to copy what we've seen. And certainly this is true among with the branding in mind. So many manufacturers see the child's mind sort of as a clean slate and then want to fill it with images and understandings of things that are being defined outside of the child's imagination. The idea is that instead of imagining what you personally might do in a situation, imagine what character A or genre B, try to replicate that or think only in those terms. And arguably the most popular brands that are out there, and you can imagine the Marvel universe or the Star Wars universe, or these larger images become surrogates, so that the person doesn't have to imagine themselves in those roles, but they can imagine being a character in that realm, and therefore emulate or pretend within that framework. And the challenge with doing so, the challenge with working within the framework, is that the images, the perceptions are not self-generated, but they're externally generated. And the ethics and morals and ideologies of those genres and those properties can then overwrite, if you will, the possible options for the individual. I am a huge advocate for imaginative play without those kind of barriers. I do believe that all input is necessary. Obviously, the more resources we take in, the more resources that we can then utilize for our own development. But the key to me is that the imaginative process needs to be stimulated at that core player level, literally the child walking out into the world and saying, what can I imagine? What is possible? So now I'm gonna narrow the gauge. Since I've been really broad in that, I'm gonna narrow this down to the gauge of role-playing games. When the property Dungeons & Dragons came to be, while it was certainly an opportunity for the developers to promote an intellectual property, a worldview, if you will, they actually presented at least a couple of different ones early on. The concept of the world of Greyhawk or the world of Blackmore were only templates. There certainly was unique information from within them, because those were the game worlds of Gygax and Arneson. But the limitation or boundary of them as the only way to play the games was never a forced thing. It was never the Greyhawk role-playing game or the Blackmore role-playing game. It was Dungeons and Dragons. And the advantage of being open as they originally were was that the storytellers and game masters that came online, such as myself, even at that early age, I was 11 at the time, and even though I was arguably nowhere near coherent enough to have an intellectual property as defined, nonetheless, I had the ability to make the world my own. And when you have that opportunity, when you're afforded a way to express that creativity, you allow others to be able to see into the way your mind thinks, into the way you perceive the world. And I think that's really the strength of role-playing. Now, mechanistically, the world became more savvy over time and realized that the engine of commerce is to create something that others could attach their imagination to, could identify with, and then utilize that identification as a way to drive commerce. You sell Halloween costumes for the characters in a story, and suddenly everybody's more able to recognize those roles, recognize how they might fit into that world, and the imagination conversion process begins, where you take the imaginative and turn them into the imitative. There's still creativity, because the individual can make up stories about what those characters might be involved with, but you're still anchoring to a vision that was not your own. The arguments that are made by Dawkins and others about how we convey information and how the very ideas themselves become almost organisms, hence the term memes today, as a parallel to genes. The idea that a memory or a mental picture can become as tangible inside the mind as the physical object, and therefore you can appropriate a person or subsume a person's will to a larger picture by aligning their imagination with the created. So therefore being able to operate and manipulate the mind does seem to hold. The idea that our concepts are often colored and adjusted by what we see and what we experience, but to me that weakens the human resolve. It weakens the human portion of the equation and converts us more into a willing recipient of consumables. We love Star Wars, so we'll purchase properties that have the Star Wars brand. We'll wear clothes that are reminiscent of the Star Wars environment, whether that be actually printed material or stylistically associated. We find ourselves becoming a subsection of the actual intellectual property. So, in the terms of the Nycos RPG that I'm developing, that's in the process right now of being edited for publication, the emphasis is not on an intellectual property. The consumer can use it for whatever purpose. You could play any setting or scene you wanted through the Nycos RPG mechanism without anything binding it up or interfering with it. And yet, you have the agency to literally make the adventures in the world your own. And I think that's really essential, because we've fallen into a trap. The mechanisms behind Dungeons and Dragons and the raft of copycat and emulated products that have come out since then, all mechanistically use basically the same structure. I mentioned last night in the video that I did that the concept of the character as a list of attributes and a logistics pool of health is everywhere, and it really evolved from, or actually I wouldn't say evolved, it actually emulates and copies the concepts that were used in development of war games in the 60s and 70s, as we as a nation recognized that winning battles had more to do with eliminating the opponent's war fighting capability than actually destroying their units. But I'll deal with that in a later video. I'm trying to stay on focus, on point for what I'm trying to get across this episode, and that is play is essential to human advancement. And the argument that playing a game on your phone and moving pieces around on a virtual screen does not constitute imaginative play in any stretch, because you're simply responding to a visual stimulus. And while that process can be somewhat enjoyable, there's a calming, there's a feeding of the dopamine, etc. when things occur on the screen, there is not an iota, if you will, of human creativity. There are no ways to adjust or alter or revise the game from the outside. There's no way for us to invoke creativity into what are called games in a lot of cases. So when I speak of Nycos RPG and I talk about the state of the game, I'm actually talking about the state of play, how we interact, how we engage, and how we connect. Now, when we are talking about a classic game, I need to perhaps specify specifically what I refer to as a game so that there's no confusion. To me, the categories or characteristics of a game is that it is an event of limited duration wherein two or more minds, individuals, are interacting utilizing a commonly agreed to set of mechanisms whereby their direct input interactionally derives a result. Whether that be a win-loss, as in the case of most games that you might think of, or the progression of the story in a role-play game. I don't limit that in terms of it can be done in certain electronic formats. There are certain games that do allow for imagination and creativity, but I would argue that most of those are set up in a way so that they are still interactional, but perhaps displaced by time. So, for example, story-based role-playing games. Oh dear. I'll have to take a break. I'll be right back.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Sales calls, you know how fun that is. At any rate, lost my train of thought. It was right there at the station. Give me a second and I'll recall where we were. If you're in the chat and or if you're in the station and know where I was, you could feel free to put a bump in and let me know in the chat. But no, we were referring to gameplay. Oh, as for example, in the case of the definition of say, even a jigsaw puzzle, all the way up to some of the long-term story-based RPGs, are fundamentally a predetermined set of moves generated by the creator, and then the participant, the producer of the game, basically pre-makes all the moves that are going to be required for resolution, whether it be the completion of the jigsaw puzzle or the end of the story RPG. Those are set in advance, and therefore the player then is taking the turns doing the actions to complete that puzzle or that roleplay game by the actions they do separately. So therefore it's as if one person basically pre-played all the moves in the game and then has to wait for the other player to make all the interim moves to bring the story to resolution. Arguably, it's still a game. It's still engaging the mind. It still is a challenge. One mind setting a set of objectives and another mind having to work through the resolution of them. But it's not, to me, the clearest definition of a game, because it's not both players real-time engaging and interacting. And it could be two players, it might be 50 if the game is coherent and understandable enough for everyone to be a part of it. Even, for example, card game tournaments are an example of this. They're actually engaging. They might have 50 players, but their resolution will eventually come down to 2 and a conclusion. And in a classic role-playing situation, that's not the case, because the story is always on the advance and always continuing. The storyteller is just as engaged in building the new pieces and then resolving them with the players as they move along. With this understanding of games, therefore, when we look back at the children we were talking about before, let's do a quick comparison. Just say two children are playing with, G.I. Joes and Barbies, whatever. They're playing with their toys, and there are no rules. There's no explanation for proper use of them. There's no defining, outlining, mechanistic barriers to the way the persons play. So you would think this sounds like it would be quite imaginative, and it is in the individual. But the challenge is that there is no framework for comparative valuation between individuals that are both playing with the same arguable toys. They're both playing with the same mechanism, but there are no framework. There is no framework or way to weave the two together. So the only way they can ultimately interact is person A says, well, my object, this human form model, is doing this or has this capability. To which the other player, who has no framework for even really understanding what that person's observation means, then responds with their perception. Well, my physical object does thus. And this inability for connection becomes problematic if the person never does find a means for meshing. Certainly, if you're utilizing your articulate figure of a being and you're smashing its head on the ground time after time, that can be arguably seen as a bad thing. But there is no intrinsic rule that says you must treat this object with any kind of respect, and therefore it's a thing to do. It's an action, and therefore it's not able to be judged or even defined properly. So children building with blocks. One of them might build vertically, the other one might spread the blocks out horizontally. The mechanism for interaction through toys is extremely limited, because unless you are conveying additional internal, or perhaps if you're talking about a parent, don't bash your toy into the TV set, mechanistic rules outside of the toy, there's no way for those individuals to actually transfer meaning. Now let's take the same two children and put them in front of a checkerboard. A checkerboard has parameters, it has numbers of pieces, it has the concept of turns. You act and then the other opponent acts, and then you act and the opponent acts. And so therefore there's a regimentation, but also there's now a vocabulary. There are terms that become understandable by both participants, and therefore they both now have a way to integrate their imaginative processes. Now, in the case of a game like checkers, there certainly are stipulations, regulations that bind the players to that action, and therefore they are limited from eating the playing pieces or whatever. That's not part of the rules. But the number of actions that can be done in a given game are nigh unto infinite. There's X number of checker pieces on the board and X number of squares, and you must follow the rules of convention of where they move. But as you're moving them across the board, you are interacting with a limited response, and therefore it makes even the process of communication more quick, because you are forcing the limitation so that understanding will be quicker. Obviously, playing checkers with somebody that doesn't know how to play checkers can be frustrating the first game, but after the second or third game, they will understand the rules enough to make the game itself equally challenging for both players, regardless of their skill level. And this back and forth that leads to this communication is the interplay, or the play that we're talking about, and what I refer to when I'm about playing games. You're engaging with the others in a way that you both are gaining understanding, meaning, and perhaps skill at the particular game. Having said that, therefore, when we talk about role-playing games as they have become, there was a radical shift somewhere in the past between the creative process of building a persona and creating an image in your own mind of what that person looks like, and then interacting with the world as defined by the storyteller. And that's now been supplanted, because the very rules manufacturers, the persons who make the rules, started to create emulation pathways. And what I mean by that is the very process of imitation must start with a template, must start with something to be imitated. And so the very concept of a intellectual property somewhat shifted. Pardon me, I'm about to sneeze. Say pineapple enough times, it'll be fine. The concept of the intellectual property shifted. Instead of being the intellectual property as a setting for emulation and replication, it became a mechanism for replication and duplication and imitation. And in the mid-1980s, in the period known as the D20 glut, as hundreds of new companies sprang up overnight to utilize the open game license mechanism that the Dungeons and Dragons administrators had released. Suddenly, there were all of these new persons, but what they were emulating and what they were duplicating was the mechanism. And they were glorifying the differences within the mechanism, but what they I don't think that anybody really paid attention to was the fact that what they were doing was creating a mechanism for duplication of redundancy, of the unimaginative part of role-playing. I say that because the rules mechanism of any role-playing game itself becomes the restriction and barrier for interactive play. That isn't to say that the mechanism can't be used for imaginative creative play. It certainly could be. But the appeal of the new skills, the new species, the new feats became so attractive that they were no longer looking at how we're playing and how creativity can be different and how it can be expressed in different ways. So, therefore, the games manufacturers and in arguably the zeitgeist of all role players became locked to the concept of that logistics model from the 1960s, the pass-fail mechanism of rolling against a threshold and only succeeding or failing against that threshold, even as the threshold might move up and down from encounter to encounter. Nonetheless, you still were setting a bar and all shots had to be above the bar or they were misses. Kind of restricted and limited the possible outcomes. Now, the biggest challenge of all of that in real terms, in modern terms, is that the types of stories that can be told with role-playing games became restricted because the game mechanic depended upon combat so strongly. The resolution was always find the monster, beat the monster, kill the monster. There was really no mechanism built into it to be effective in terms of other story dynamics or other resolutions. There wasn't a mechanism for negotiating with the barbarians. There was no assuaging an onslaught by offering bribes. There was no mechanism really for that because those mechanisms had been subsumed by the attractiveness of the combat mechanism. And the attractiveness of the combat mechanism ironically becomes, in modern era, the most problematic portion of it, and that is that the concept of the hit point pool, the concept of the logistics mechanism being almost like a superpower, they became so problematic as to make negative resolutions unviable. Now, when we talk about that, the one thing to remember is that games, when they are interactive and they are imaginative and creative, are still going to be a struggle for integration. You're still wanting to link that which is known, the game mechanism, with that which is unknown, which is the story. And the mechanism can become so tightly woven and dependent upon the combat system that a break in the combat system can actually unzip, if you will, the connections that have been made and therefore separate the story from the personas involved. The characters now are independent agents that have there's no longer any connection with the story, and therefore they become, if you will, free agent, free radicals, is that the term? They're free radicals in the biosphere of the game environment, and therefore make it difficult to continue creative story building because they have disconnected. So in our world, therefore, it became much more easy to link to the brands that we know, because that way the story is there, resolute, even when the players have gone free radical. Their free radical nature, their desire to be independent, can operate without assailing the main storyline, because it has been created and established by others, and therefore it becomes a sounding board instead of a integral part of the persona's development. This, I think, is the real danger, because as we do this, as we create these resolute, uniform, franchise, identifiable stories, these people, this mechanism is dependent upon the sale of the value of the primary story. And they don't depend on the interaction of your players, so that from a manufacturer's side, they're secure, their story will always be there. But the challenge is that the players no longer have that agency, and therefore they fall more into being imitative in order to mesh than to be creative and therefore not be able to mesh. So the inherent danger of that is that we create an environment where role play has now shifted from creating a role and then building a story around it and evolving the persona into something unique. And instead it becomes a matter of how efficiently you can match your persona build to a successful template that merges and gets all of the advantages of the story, pretty much independent of actually being a part of it. And that, to me, is the great danger. And the element, therefore, of that Nycos RPG tries to cover is to disengage the mechanism, the gameplay engine, and make it fluid enough to be able to merge with your players' desires, and therefore make it supple and manipulatable for both the player and the game master. In that, therefore, the meeting of the minds, the very thing that play is supposed to integrate smoothly, becomes part and parcel to that mechanism. Now, it's not like I'm talking like a college professor again, so I apologize for that. Let me see if I can break it down. If Bobby and Tommy want to play a role-playing game, they can play Star Wars or Faerun or name fantasy realm here, Lord of the Rings, Middle Earth, whatever. You can play in those environments, but they're restricted in terms of the game master's creativity, because he has to fit what story he's building into the environment of a pre-developed world. Nycos RPG tries to instead say, no, the world is in the control of the game master. He can adjust it as rapidly and as easily as the players, their side of the equation. So yes, Tommy and Bobby are still playing outside, and Tommy saying, Bobby, I shot you, and Bobby saying, no, you didn't, and whoever the game master is the one who actually says, guys, we're both in the same fictional world, but I'm kind of directing stories. So Tommy, you did shoot Bobby, and Bobby, you've got to be 3-second timeout, whatever adjudication comes down. But then they are all interacting in a way so that there's not a solid frame against which they have to limit themselves. There's no imitation brand laid down in front of them they must adhere to. There's no, can a person be can a person have magic powers and also wield a sword? Roleplay games tend to try to frame it so that it's a yes or no to create the class structure to promote the new secondary classes, to promote feats and skills in the fashion of Dungeons and Dragons. But those limits are therefore hindering the development of the stories. Now, let's see, trying to read my clock. Okay, so I got some time. So here in the last quarter of the show or whatever, I want to take a little bit of time and look at how gameplay affects real life. And perhaps this is a bit deeper than we've been talking, so I apologize in advance. I may eventually split these into separate sections, but the very idea of imagination and creativity doesn't stop at the tabletop for a role-play game. It doesn't stop at the framework of an event for live-action role-play. The very concept of interactive imagination has everything to do with the way we live our lives. What do we have in our lives that is patternistic and ritual? There's so many different things that I could address. But in today's world, there is a huge movement of those speaking of intention and manifestation and the human's ability to change the environment they are in by changing their internal mind. And there is a huge lever in that, because it certainly is true. Each day we wake up, we have an opportunity to simply do things differently than we've done in any days before. We can become more. And the big challenge in the idea of intention and manifestation is there's a lot of talk, a lot of bluster, a lot of puffery, if you will, as you focus your mind on these imagination things and try to create literally a force of will change to the world. But the reality is that the only thing that we mechanically can change is ourselves. And while that it does include our mental processes, it doesn't mean that our manifestation capability is anything other than what we choose to do. And so therefore a role-playing mechanism, the playfulness of a role-play mechanism, is a way for our minds and the rest of us to change in like fashion. For example, in my case, one of the things I've been, pardon this idea, but almost 30 years ago, I made a bet with a couple of associates about which one of us would lose 50 pounds first. And to date, with 30 years behind us, none of us have accomplished it. And while I would argue I'm closer than the rest of them because I have been watching what I eat perhaps better than they, I nonetheless haven't succeeded. And it was literally the argument of intention. I kept saying, I want to do this, but that intention wasn't being met with any action. And so I began to role play what it will be like when I'm thinner, what that would mean, the fact that perhaps I might enter the dating scene again after a bunch of years of being on my own and not needing that. The role play of it is to start thinking about what those possibilities might be, and then trying to compare what those role play environment conditions are and what conditions I have now, and trying to form a pattern by which those engage. Well, to be perceived as being thinner means I obviously must be physically more active, because I must be out there doing more, because that's the mental picture I have of the role-playing environment for me, is as I role-play, seeing myself as the thin guy. Then I'm thinking, well, the thin guy doesn't sit in his apartment and just do frivolous things. He's out engaging with people. He's dynamic. He's there's a level of improved popularity with the you're more accepted within other communities when you're thin than you are when you're overweight. That's practically canon for groups like Weight Watchers. I guess they don't call themselves that any longer, but the concept of being a different person. We did it when we were kids. We imagined being astronauts. We imagined being firemen, and in many cases, those children took that imaginative course and became the very things that they focused on. If they wanted to be an astronaut, then they knew what they needed to do to get there. They knew which schools they had to go to. They knew what kind of circles they had to run in, and they started to imagine what that life would look like. And at first it was just the glorious grand, I'm walking on the moon, I'm doing the spacewalk, I'm saving the star station, the star base, or whatever. All those creative areas were first, and then you build back into the more mundane over time. And the reality is that we can use that mechanism. I call it Imagination Launchpad, and I can actually help you develop the process whereby that can happen. The mechanism of Imagination Launchpad fundamentally is a combination of several different steps that you take, and they're not in succession. They are basically you whole hog. You've heard that phrase. You go to the butcher, and instead of just buying the bacon, you buy the whole hog. Well, in this case of going whole hog, you're going to be incorporating the imagination in ways that you haven't in a really long time. If you're a role player, you use them more frequently. If you have you done drama and acting, you've done some of it before. But the point is that the development of these things give us the opportunity to literally change our world by changing our minds. And in order to change our minds, we have to be able to imagine that, create that change, and then start to integrate the imagined world with the real world in such a way that they get closer to merging. Now, that doesn't mean that, for example, the fantasy world of Nycos is going to in any way manifest on Earth. That's not at all what I'm portraying. What I'm saying is the very mechanisms that work for role play in the abstract actually work in the real, if we, again, by the rules, limit ourselves to the barriers and framework of this reality. And I'll go more into that in the next episode. We are coming up on the end of the show. If you like what you've seen, make sure you follow the channel. If you have input and would like to share information with me, feel free to leave it in the chat box while I'm on there, or in comments section afterwards. These episodes will, in time, also be aired over on our YouTube channel, which is at Nycos RPG. If you want to look at the Nycos RPG product as it currently is available in its prototype form, you can check that out at www.nycosrpg.com. And if you want more lore or more understanding of the realm that is Nycos, the fictional side of things, you can check out our World Anvil page at nycosrpg.info. And if not, thank you so much for your time. If you appreciate the show, we appreciate you as the audience. I will be doing another episode at 11 p.m. tonight, and I'm going to be changing the hour of this show until 11 a.m. starting tomorrow. So it'll be 11 a.m. and 11 p.m. Monday through Friday, with some Saturday shows as well. And a lot more information coming up about the actual Nycos RPG. The schedule will be here on Twitch, so take a look at that, and it'll give you an idea of the airing of the episodes as we have them. And in the future, they'll be much more streamlined, and so you'll have an idea of what's coming in each episode coming up. but for right now it's general. So 11 a.m., 11 p.m., Monday through Friday. I hope to see you on the next show. I'm Jonathan Alvin. This has been Nycos RPG. Have a great life.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice. Played 1,000 hours and I think that I died just once. Or maybe twice. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Always did. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Like a kid. I'm well respected as a lord of the blade. Got a dozen guildmates, always up for a late night raid. Though I wouldn't know them by a name or a face. We fight like brothers in a war with the dark elf race. In a dying age, I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Always did. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Like a kid. Dungeons. Dungeons. Caves and halls. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Hits and falls. So now you know why I'm glued to my chair. And what you call real life just doesn't compare. I bear no grudges. I live in dungeons. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Always did. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Like a kid. Dungeons. Dungeons. Always did. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Like a kid. Dungeons. Dungeons. Caves and halls. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Hits and falls. Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice. Played 1,000 hours and I think that I died just once, or maybe twice. I live in dungeons, dungeons, always did. I live in dungeons, dungeons, like a kid. I'm well respected as a lord of the blade. Got a dozen guildmates, always up for a late night raid. Though I wouldn't know them by a name or a face. We fight like brothers in a war with the dark elf race. In a dying age, I live in dungeons, dungeons, always did. I live in dungeons, dungeons, like a kid. Dungeons, dungeons, caves and halls. I live in dungeons, dungeons, pits and falls. So now you know why I'm glued to my chair, and what you call real life just doesn't compare. I bear no grudges. I live in dungeons. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Always did. I live in dungeons. Dungeons. Like a kid. Dungeons, dungeons, always did. I live in dungeons, dungeons, like a kid. Dungeons, dungeons, caves and halls. I live in dungeons, dungeons, pits and falls. Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice. Played 1,000 hours and I think that I died just once, or maybe twice. I live in dungeons, dungeons, always did. I live in dungeons, dungeons, like a kid. respected as a lord of the blade. Got a dozen guildmates, always up for a late night raid. Though I wouldn't know them by a name or a face, we fight like brothers in a war with the dark elf race. In a dying age, I live in dungeons